welcome everyone. Great to have you all. If I was in the States, I'd say y'all. Now, you'll notice on the screens a couple questions before we begin. And as we wait for a couple more people to come, this is what I'd like you to do, is some thinking. Now, we're going to be looking at metacognition, grit, and growth mindset. And I want you to be thinking, what do you already know about these three things? And what questions do you already have? So I'd like you to just reflect for a moment. What do you know about metacognition, growth mindset, and grit? What kind of questions do you have about any of those three? Now that wasn't long, but what I want you to turn to is people at your table and have a quick conversation about what you already know and what questions do you have. Go ahead, and if you haven't introduced yourself, please introduce yourself and have a quick conversation about what you already know. Go ahead. Now, throughout this session, I'm going to be getting you to talk, obviously, with people at your table, but then there's the sad news, I'm always going to have to bring you back to the large group. But I'm hoping you had a chance to do two things. Number one, get to know the people at your table. And number two, just start kind of connecting and thinking about the topic. Because we're going to build on that over the next 80 minutes. So, first I'm going to talk a little bit about who I am. Why? So you can kind of see the perspective I bring on this topic. Now, a little bit about my background. Back in 2005, I was the founding director for the Center for Teaching and Learning at UBC Okanagan. And UBC Okanagan is the University of British Columbia up in Canada. How many know where Vancouver is? Most people know where Vancouver is. Well, the Okanagan's 400 kilometers inland from Vancouver, east of Vancouver. And our campus is about 8,000 students, so a nice, intimate university campus. While I was director, and I led a team that was kind of supporting the university's teaching and learning excellence, I was also teaching. I taught learning technology, assessment, at the grad level, instructional design, and at the doctoral level, a teaching and learning in higher ed course, which was absolutely fabulous. My research is looking at helping students take a scholarly approach to learning and helping with academic success. And that's where I kind of got involved. And I'll tell you a little bit more about more specifics where I'm coming from with this particular research that I've been doing on this topic. Now, this won't be all just about research. Part of the research was I created a lot of curricular interventions to help support students with metacognition, growth mindset, and grit. So let's talk about where we're going to go. So we need to unpack these three terms. At your table, you already started talking about it. And I already heard quite a few catchphrases and things related to these topics. So we'll unpack and make sure everyone feels really comfortable with these three constructs. Then I want to get into the practicality and some of the strategies that I've been introducing and using with students in the classroom. And then obviously, I want to also get the collective intelligence in this room and kind of hear about some of the things that you're doing as well. So we'll start with the metacognitive strategies and move on to the growth mindset strategies. There we go. The growth mindset strategies. And of course, grit. And how do we build grit within our students. And then we'll wrap it all up and kind of reflect on what we did and how it might relate to some of the things that you're doing and what you might want to do in your class. So let's start unpacking the three. So before we get really in deep with the three, there's some generalities that I want to mention. First of all three constructs can be taught, which is key, because in this room we're full of educators, and if we weren't able to teach it, there's no point kind of being here talking about how we're going to help students learn it. A big piece, though, is all of them have a relationship with academic success. And then when I was doing my research, I defined academic success as not necessarily learning, but their grades for the course, their GPA for the term, as well as their incoming GPA. So we hope that correlates with learning. Well, it should, but I can't guarantee it. And the big piece, and one of the big messages is metacognition and growth mindset support the grit, which is kind of helping students persist and overcome challenges to reach their goals. Metacognition has the strategy, and growth mindset we'll unpack in a minute. You'll see how important it is with helping students not give up to reach their goals. So let's start with metacognition. Well, obviously, humans have always been metacognitive. Back in the 1970s, though, Flavel from Stanford, he coined the term. And he simply said it's our ability to think about our thinking, kind of that monitoring our thinking. And many of us experience it all the time, and we're probably thinking about our thinking right now. But if you remember reading a book, and you're monitoring, and you're studying a book, but sometimes when you're reading a book, you'll be reading along and you'll realize, hold it a second, I have no idea what I read for the last 3 pages. Why? Because I've been thinking about what's for dinner. But when you are reading and you are engaged, you're kind of monitoring that learning and what you're picking up from your reading. And that's kind of that metacognition, being able to monitor your thinking, which is a key skill that we need everyone to have, which will help learn. Now, another big piece is we're asking students to be more self-directed. In other words, instead of being kind of transmitters of information to students, we're asking students to take a bigger role and taking more responsibility for their learning. So what we want from our students, we want them to kind of have a process. So that when we give them, for example, an assignment, maybe it's a research paper, we want them to be able to be successful with that research paper. One of the first things that expert learners do is they assess the demands of the task. In other words, they take a look and say, what's the teacher asking me to do for this research paper? And they kind of start unpacking that research paper. What are they asking me to do? And then they need to evaluate their own knowledge and skills. So the teacher's asking me to do a research paper. Well, I'm a really strong writer. That's good. However, I'm not very good with my library skills and finding research. It's that ability to kind of find and know your strengths and weaknesses and identify where you may need to put a little bit more effort. And then an expert learner will plan their approach. So the prof is asking to have this research paper done in 1 month. An expert learner will then kind of plan. They'll realize that, hold it a second, maybe it's science. I'm taking first year biology, chemistry, physics, math, which all have labs, and a class as well as an English class. So I'm busy. So they need to structure when they're going to do it. And they realize they have other assignments. So they'll actually plan their approach. And as they're working on the research paper, they monitor their progress and adjust the strategies. So as they're working, maybe they're having difficulty with finding resources for the research paper. So what do? They consult a librarian to help them with that weakness. And they adjust their strategies. And then, before they hand it in, they'll reflect and evaluate their strategies upon completion. So before they'll hand it in, they'll kind of evaluate to see how they've done. They hand it in. They'll use that feedback. They'll reflect and think to themselves, why did these strategies, here's how I did it on my paper, what am I going to do next time? Now I want you to think for a moment. What % of your students do this? That they assess the demands of the task, evaluate their own knowledge and skills, plan their approach, monitor and adjust their strategies as needed, reflect and evaluate so they don't make the same mistakes, that they become a better learner, that they become a better research paper writer. What %? Would anyone like to venture a guess in their own context? What kind of % have that strategy? What do you think? 10% I'm hearing? Anyone higher? Yes. But wouldn't it be nice if 100% of our students had this, right? This would be so nice. So how do we get them there? Well, we're going to talk about that today. How do we get them to here so that they are successful with their learning? Now, that's metacognition. Now, some of the issues that we're running into and what kind of spawned me to work on this is, and some of you might be able to relate to this, students don't know what they know and don't know. Does that kind of ring a bell with you? We're finding that a huge challenge, and when I talk about the interventions, we're going to be talking about this one. Because a lot of students, especially coming into first year, they think they know it. They go into the exam, and there's a huge disappointment because they don't know it. They don't know it at the level that they need to know it, that the prof is asking. They were very successful in high school, but there's kind of that rude awakening first midterm. When all of a sudden they're used to an A average, they all of a sudden go to a C average, which is a real shock to the system. The other big thing is we find students don't plan, monitor, or evaluate the learning. And we actually have to scaffold and help them do that because they don't naturally do it. It'd be nice if they did, but they don't. So those are a couple of the big issues that they'll address. Yeah?
So, Peter, one of the things that around the planning, monitoring, and evaluating of learning that I've come in contact with is students, and the challenge around that is that students don't necessarily see that that's their role. Particularly if they've just come through from a high school environment where that kind of thing's actually all been done by teachers.
Yes.
And so what we end up having to do is this whole sort of, I've had kids coming and talking to me about when's the second draft due. I'm going, no, darling, that was your draft. That was your assessment. It's because they've been almost conditioned into this thought process that somebody else is doing all of those things.
Right, and I think that's a key piece that we need to help them with, is that transition, and to communicate our expectations and why. Often, it isn't, we're not trying to be mean to the students. It's actually helping them learn. If we do it for them, they're not learning the same way as if they do it. We need to communicate that and communicate that transition. In high school, you were in a class of 30. Now in first year chemistry, you're in a class of 600. Totally different field. And expectations of what they need to do. So we need to communicate that. Now, growth mindset. This is an interesting one, and I heard someone mention this because wherever I go, this is so big in the K-12 system, whether I'm in Canada, United States, or here in Australia. Is it Jackie?
Yeah.
Jackie mentioned this, and I'll get you to maybe share in a second. Growth mindset is all about intelligence. Some people believe they're born with a certain amount of intelligence and there isn't much they can do about it. Whereas others believe that yes, they're born with a certain amount of intelligence, but through effort they can improve. And this is really key because you may have heard, especially, I hate picking on math, but you hear in math classes, I'm bad at math, I've always been bad at math, and there's nothing I can do about it. My sister was bad at math, my father was bad at math, and so I'm bad at math. And there's nothing I can do about it. And it's really tragic. It's that fixed mindset, which is really sad. The key is, it's interesting because a lot of them play sports. And if you ask them about their football, or basketball, or cricket, I won't use hockey, not many people play hockey out here, but they have a growth mindset in sports. Because they'll spend 3 hours practicing football. Why? Because they know they'll get better. So they have a growth mindset when it comes to sports, or sometimes even music. They'll practice the piano. Why? Because they know they'll get better. But then when it comes to math, they give up. I can't do this. I was born this way. I can't do anything about it, which is really tragic. And they give up. Why? Because they feel they can't control it. If you're born with it, they can't control how much intelligence they have. But if they have a growth mindset and they believe that the more effort they put in, the better they'll be, they can control effort, but they can't control how they're born. So it's really important that they understand that growth mindset and the more effort they put in. Yes, you might be here in math, but at least you can come up here. You might not ever be up here, but at least you can grow, which is key. Because students who believe they're in the fixed mindset, what happens is they give up easily or they turn to cheating. Why do they turn to cheating? Because they feel they can't do it any other way. So this is a key piece, and we'll unpack it more. But Jackie, you mentioned the not yet piece. Do you want to quickly mention not yet? Because that's what they learn in K to 12.
Yeah, so my children go to Northern State School and they use the word Carol directly in the growth mindset. And the key word around the school is, I can't do it yet. And they really emphasise that it's okay for the children to acknowledge their limitations, but as long as they acknowledge their limitations and then say, but I can't do it yet. I will be able to if I keep trying, if I keep making it better. And it's a sort of underpinning the learning philosophy at the school.
Exactly. Thank you. And what I'm seeing too is, big time, they're really focusing on the growth mindset in the K to 12. Now, when I've been working on with first years, I've pulled over 2,500 students. Other than this year, there was a bit of an anomaly. But up to now, it's been a 60-40 split. 40% of the students in our first year come in with a fixed mindset, meaning they're born with a certain amount of intelligence and there isn't much they can do about it. And that's a problem. And I'll talk about strategies to overcome that. It's nice that it's 60% do have a growth mindset, but it's that 40%, that's a huge amount that believe there isn't much they can do about their intelligence. Kind of sad. Now, grit. Now, many of you know about Duckworth's work, and you may have read the book on grit by Duckworth as well. I like this second definition, and it's the persistence over time to overcome challenges and accomplish big goals. Which makes sense. When we were growing up, sometimes we talked about things like perseverance, grit, determination, those kinds of words. They're all related. If someone doesn't have grit and can't overcome challenges to accomplish big goals like a 4-year degree, passing a class, those kinds of things, they're not going to be successful. And I'll talk about things like failure in a few minutes and its role, and the role of growth mindset and metacognition. But grit is key. And with the studies that Duckworth's been using, it's not only correlates highly with academic success, but also in life. She kind of looked at all the different factors, social intelligence, physical health, IQ, all these different factors. But the thing that predicted success the best was grit. And I can really see it in our first-year students coming in, that transition. A lot of them have moved away from home for the first time. Whole life has changed for them. If they don't have grit, when they have challenges put in front of them, we don't want them giving up. We need them to embrace challenge and overcome those obstacles. And we need to help them with that. And a lot of the biggest things when I talk to students, a lot of them fear failure. And that's an important piece. And then they don't embrace challenge because they fear not being successful. Questions about grit or growth mindset or metacognition before we start with the strategies? Questions?
More
Deanna.
observation. Grit is not necessarily a word I'm familiar with. It's not common language in my background. Is there an Australian resilience?
Resilience is very close to grit. One of the factors of the grit scale is resiliency and effort. Two big pieces with grit, which makes sense. Jackie?
What's the relationship between grit and perfectionism?
Perfectionism.
Yeah.
Well,
I'm not talking about myself, dear. I'm talking about law students in particular. They're well known for their perfection.
well, if you're driven to be perfect, that drive can help you overcome potentially obstacles. That's where I see some relationship. And the grit piece is overcoming those obstacles to reach somewhere. And some of those perfectionists are that way. Not all of them, but some of them would have that relationship.
Plus with Lawrence, our top scorer in OP1, so you are attracting this group which are high achievers.
Yes.
And high achievers often see in that realm of perfection.
Interesting. Yes, I agree. Dom?
How much is there a relationship between a growth mindset about physical skills in sport, intellectual abilities, and then also grit? Because I caught myself also thinking feeling grit's more fixed, but I know
Grit is more
fixed in my own. Well, I was just thinking about myself doing.
Yeah.
My immediate reaction is that grit is more fixed, and how common is it that people have different or fixed approaches to those different areas?
Okay, so growth mindset kind of supports grit, and we'll get into that in a minute. But grit, you're born with about 37% grit. Most characteristics is about 37%, but grit can be learned. How do we know it's the 37%? Twin studies, identical twins. That's how they've always researched kind of some of these characteristics to kind of see what percent are you kind of born with and how much can you grow and learn. So yes, you can grow grit It isn't fixed, but you need to give them the strategies. And the strategies is like, it can be tools like metacognitive tools, or it could be like a growth mindset, which is very important about kind of that drive and kind of that embracing challenge and not fearing failure.
So there'd
Robin?
also be a connection with goal setting.
Yes.
If they have goals,
Yes.
that is going to bring all three of them together. But if they have no goals, they're really just wandering around the desert and
Yes.
whatever comes. Because
Exactly.
There's nothing to take them. There's no place that they want to get to.
And you'll see, Robin, we're going to talk about that in a few minutes. Exactly. When we get to grit and strategies, we're going to be talking about goal setting. Very important piece. Thank you. Let's start with some of the strategies. Now, how many of you in the room give students exams? Yeah, quite a few. Okay, we're going to start with exams. So, this first handout, it may look like your basic exam prep. It might not. I'm not sure. Take one, pass it around. Belinda. Margaret, sorry, Margaret. Thank you. And oh, yeah, boy, Peter's passing out. Failed. We'll get that. We'll get there. Thanks so much. Now, you'll notice on the front some exam strategies. Now, here's a quiz question for you. I've surveyed over 2,500 students on this question. And I asked the following, how many of you study the way you do because you were taught? What % of students say they study the way they do because they've been taught how to study? What %? Okay. Good guess. You're in the range. You're in the area. You're in the ballpark. Well, we're talking beta scale. 20%, and it's fairly consistent every year. So 1 in 5. 1 in 5 say they study the way they do because they were taught. Now, the front of this page, this one's just an example from biology that I use. Front of the page talks about evidence-based strategies. In this whole thing, 5-10 minutes in class we spend. Why so little? Because it's first year. Who has more than 5 to 10 minutes for anything other than content? So, we spend 5 to 10 minutes. And I usually send it to them ahead of time. I ask them a few questions. How did you study in high school? Or last year, if they were in second year, or whatever year they're in. I get them thinking, how did they study? Then we briefly talk about some of the important strategies. For example, practice testing. Practice testing is very important. Why? It does 2 things. Number 1, the practice part helps with actually learning. That practicing is very important. But just as importantly, it lets students know what they know and what they don't know. That practice testing lets them know where their gap is, where they need to spend extra time learning. And they become more efficient and effective learners. So that practice testing, not only practicing, is the learning, lets them know what they know and what they don't know. Yes?
So with the practice testing, you have to be quite explicit that it's practicing it like an exam. So I do a lot of academic advising, and there's a number of students who have like academic progression warnings and stuff like that. I go, do you do practice exams? Yes. And then I'll, at least 9 out of 10, I'll I'll say, well, do you do that with the textbook and with the notes open next to you? Yes.
Yeah.
So very few actually take it as an opportunity to test what they know. They see it as an exercise to do, and therefore I've done a test and therefore I'm prepared.
And that's that false sense of security too. It's like when you ask them to read, or they read the chapter and they think they know it. Why? Because they put some yellow highlighting in and they think, hey, I read it, I know it because I highlighted it. They don't know it, and that's the real challenge and the real tragedy. A couple others on there. I did put about the importance of finding a study group. Richard Light from Harvard did a big analysis of all the factors of success. And what did he come up with? Students who found and maintained a study group were successful. And it does a couple things. Yes, it has that social support, but what goes on in a study group? It's that peer teaching going on. So you learn it at a completely different level if you have to teach it to someone else or you discuss it. You externalize your ideas and you create knowledge through that, which is really key. Another one I put down is visualization. And I usually talk to them because most of our students, a good percent, were student athletes. And I say, when you're an athlete, how many of you use visualization? Oh yeah, of course, yeah. And then I ask them, when you're studying for exam, do you use visualization? No, not at all. So the visualization was big, especially in the Olympics in the 70s, is just visualizing yourself. If you're, let's say, a 100-meter runner, you visualize yourself sprinting and doing the right form in the right place for the track event. In exams, the night before the exam, you visualize yourself in the room where you're going to write the test. You see yourself writing the exam, that you're coming up with answers, you're even practicing answers in your head, and you feel a lot more comfortable. Because a lot of the problems are students have exam anxiety, and visualization really helps. However, they haven't made that leap from sports to learning. So those are just three, but that isn't the key part. Over the back is the key part. So after we go through some important strategies, I get them to create a plan. And this is just a simple scaffold on the back that asks them some basic questions about planning how they are going to study for the exam. And I get them to fill it out. And then I get them to share it with one other person. Why do I ask them to share their plan with one other person?
Conviction.
Pardon?
Conviction.
Yes, conviction. And accountability. How many of you have ever made a New Year's resolution? Is that popular down here?
Oh, yes.
Okay. Now, if you keep that New Year's resolution to yourself, do you keep it? Less likely, but if you tell everyone or tell a few people, hey, I'm going to run a marathon this year, that puts a little bit of pressure on you to actually start training. So that's one piece why I get them to share, but just as importantly, I want them to start talking about how they study. Do students naturally just talk about how they study? No, they talk about everything else. But they don't talk to each other about studying and building those connections. So on one side is some example strategies. On the other side is that planning, which is really key. Now, hopefully they've studied, done a great job, but then the next step is to actually write the exam. And after the exam, we want them to reflect. How did they do with their exam? Thank you. Now, so they've written their exam. They get their exam back. They go through their exam, and then they do a quick reflection. Why? Because they wouldn't do it otherwise. So at the top it asks, when you left the exam, what do you think you got? And they put it in. Usually it's high, like an 8. Then they have to put, what did they actually get? Well, that's probably around the C level. Then it asks questions about how much time they spent on the exam, what percent of classes did they attend, did they cram, did they spend kind of space they're studying, and then what actual strategies did they use? So if you're doing this, I would change based on your discipline what strategies that they would use. So the front is, how did they prepare for the exam? And then they turn over the back, and it says, now that you've looked over your exam, where did you run into some challenges? So they need to recognize and think about, where were their problems? But the key piece of this is, number 11, what are you going to do next time? Because what we find is students will use the same ineffective strategy over and over again. And what this does is help them realize, this is how I prepared for the exam, here's how I did, what did I learn from that, and what am I going to do next time? And unfortunately, if we don't get them to do this, very few will naturally just do this. How long does that sheet take? Max 5 minutes. I get them to hand it in. And you'll notice number 11, I get them to write down what they're going to do next time in their books. Why do I have them hand it in? I have a TA then put all the responses in. And then we come back and say, students who are very successful with an 85 or higher did these things. Students who weren't successful did these things. So it lets them know some of the strategies that work and don't work. Questions about this tool? Okay. Oh, Louise.
I have two questions. So, the first one about the strategies between essentially the high achieving students and the students who aren't doing as well. Do you ever find that there's overlap where they're using the same strategies but maybe not using it in the same sort of way or
Sometimes, but usually things come out that are patterns. We see patterns. Things like some of the strategies. A lot will use ineffective strategies like just rereading instead of things like practice testing, that type of thing. So there will be patterns that are obvious between those who don't do well and that. The other thing, attendance for us is a big thing. And there's usually a relationship how often. And they are honest with this. The teacher doesn't see this. We take it. We do the data, and the teacher only sees the summary. So that's not an issue. Jackie?
Because I was going to ask you when you said about attendance, is time one of the questions? I mean, because I've been understand it quickly. Because particularly when they get to final year and they're doing clerkships in law firms and they're volunteering in community legal centres and things like that, they're time jealous. It doesn't mean they're bad students. It doesn't mean that they don't necessarily have some effective study strategies. They're just not doing it as well as they could because they're trying to do too many things.
Right, and that everything's about time for them. And number 3 asks, approximately how much time did you spend preparing for the exam in hours? And that's what we get.
So then when it comes to when you release the result and say people who got 85% did this and people who got less than that did this, what do you do about those students who, like, have you got any data about how did that affect their self-efficacy in terms of, I'm not going to get class 1 honours or something like that because I'm trying to do too many things and I just don't have the time. Like, how did this?
I don't have data on that. Right.
Yeah,
No,
because
that's-
they know to get a job,
Mhm.
you know, they have to volunteer, they have to do all these things. They, you know, they just think, how do we do it all? How, you know, that's the problem we face with our final years.
Yeah.
Shifting priorities with students.
Mhm.
Their priorities are changing in
What-
terms of what they feel that they're prepared to put into
Mhm.
their study, because there are other students that, you know, are faced with the same choices to make, but the priorities are different.
And part of that goes back to the planning exercise we get them to do. And this example was for biology. And I mentioned earlier, first year biology, they're taking biology, chemistry, physics, math, and then in English. But those 4 sciences all have labs. And a lot of them work on top of that. So time is the key, and planning is the strategy to help them with time. Because otherwise, they get hooped. All of a sudden, they realize the night before, oh, I've got a biology exam because I just finished studying for a chemistry exam the night before. And they should have done all the way along is a big strategy. Kay.
I think there's also an element of their strategy choice in terms of being efficient as well as effective. And some students can be very effective, but not necessarily efficient in time. And that getting them to actually think about, is it not only effective, but is it efficient? Is it efficient in time? And just thinking about it.
Yeah.
The more we can get them talking about this, the better though, and the more they'll learn about themselves and what works for themselves. Anne, I saw your hand.
Yeah, one of our people in biology talks to his students about exams, and he talks to them about the fact that they're not used to focusing on things because they've got Facebook here, they've got
Yeah.
music in the ears, they've got messaging on
Yeah.
there. And he says if you can't concentrate to study for 2 hours, how are you going to concentrate in an exam? This doesn't get at that problem, I guess.
That is another whole problem that you need to address with them, the whole idea of cognitive load. Cognitive load is alive and well. They can walk and chew gum at the same time, no problem. But to do things deeply, they need that focus time. Yes?
Like, do you run up against the, like that sense of people's love of the natural, that people are drawn towards someone who's good at something without apparent effort? Like, is that, so that people will look at 2 people who are equally as good at something,
Yes.
and if they see that this person has had to put in a lot of effort to achieve that,
Right.
that is less fascinating than the person who's done it just through a natural gift. Like, is that something that you're sort of breaking down through this process? And then I guess a related question around, because the way that people say, like you said, it's not something that people have been taught, it's something that people have developed as almost intrinsic belief.
Yes.
Is there a core of people that are very, very difficult to move on this? Because, like, as you know, if someone deeply holds a belief, even if you show them data completely counter to their belief,
Yeah.
they'll reject the data out of hand and actually double down on the belief.
And you're right. And you brought up a lot of important points there, and I'll pick up on a couple of them. The whole idea of that natural ability, what that reinforces is that fixed mindset. I was born a certain amount of intelligence and there isn't anything I can do about it. And often they don't realize that there was a lot of effort that went on somewhere to get to that point. Yes, people aren't born all the same way, the same slate. However, there is that effort, and they have to realize that maybe they need to put a little bit more effort in, but they can control the amount of effort they put in, which will produce some kind of results, and they have to realize that. Now this, oh, Robin?
Sorry. On the first handout that we
Yes.
had, which was effective study,
Yes.
point 8, group study.
Yes.
Now, if they have that group study and they're coming up to exams, because they are in a group, there will be, even if they are busy doing other things, they will, as a group, end up agreeing on a time when they can all get together.
Right.
And looking at what they're doing in this group study in terms of the peer teaching, comparing notes, brainstorming test questions, that really, and plus it's that visual oral learning,
Yes.
because they can remember conversations, whereas
Yes.
that black and white print's just falling straight into the black hole, is, sort of, I think, very, very key in terms of anything that's in this exam preparation.
I think it's really key too. And often we need to teach them how to be in a group. And actually what that looks like. You might even do a role play or something, because they don't necessarily know how to study in a group and how important it is to have the peer teaching going on and some of the other important aspects, because it is a very powerful way to learn. Now I'm just going to move on a little bit. Now, when you give a research paper or a big project, not just a quick assignment, this is an example of a scaffold to help them learn the types of questions they should be asking themselves that expert learners already do. The 10% that you mentioned at the beginning already do. So you'll see the headings. It says, assess the demands of the assignment. What is the instructor's goal in having me do this task? What are all the things I need to do successfully to accomplish this assignment? So in other words, it scaffolds and helps them learn the questions that they should be asking themselves when they get a major project. So after they assess the demands of the assignment, then they evaluate their own knowledge and skills on that first page. How effective are my skills that are required to complete the assignment? If I've done something like this before, how could I do a better job this time? And then you over the page. And yes, it's 3 whole pages. It might take them 5 or 6 minutes to do, I'm not sure. But it's not heavy. The key is getting them to learn the questions they need to do. And then they need to plan their approach and just a few scaffolding questions to help them with their planning. Then they need to be thinking about monitoring as they're doing the assignment. What questions are they asking themselves? What strategies am I using that are working well or not working well to help me learn? What other resources could I be using? What is the most challenging aspect of this task or most confusing? And then at the bottom of the page, adjust strategies to strengthen this assignment. So what could I be doing differently mid-assignment to address the problems or challenges? And on the last page, they self-evaluate. To what extent did I successfully accomplish the goals of the task? They self-reflect on the instructor-graded assignment. And the big question at the end, what strategies are they going to do next time? And this is really important because students aren't naturally doing it. I wish they did, but they don't. And it helps them understand the kinds of questions they should be asking themselves. So when I asked you how many percent naturally do it, it was about 10%. This is one strategy that you can do. Now, this other handout is the same thing, but shorter version. Because sometimes you don't want to give them the long version. You want a shorter version. And you might say to yourself, Peter, students would not like to do this. The students that are already challenged with assignments have just a hard enough time doing them. Why would you make them do this? Well, again, it's not to be mean and cruel. many things we can be doing as teachers that are much meaner, much crueler than having them write out some of these scaffolding to help them with their learning. But you have to tell them why they're doing it. Otherwise they won't. You might not make them do it, or you might only have a subset do this type of thing. But this is the one-page, double-sided version of the last one. So this is the second version. Okay.
Peter,
Yes.
have you used this
Yes.
as the mirror image of this working with instructors
Oh, no, I haven't.
for
used it.
assessment design? Because
Yeah, that's a good point. Thank you, dear. No, I haven't used it with instructors at all. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, it can really help the clarity of the design, because if the students can't work out what the assessor is wanting to know, then it's bad design. Yeah.
Thank you, Margaret. Jackie?
So, yes, so I have teaching focused staff who complain about students' inability to plan and all that kind of stuff. So what are your thoughts on building some of this into like a pre-assessment, like staged assessment, and this is part of a pre-assessment task
Yes.
that you get marks for?
Thank you.
Does it work?
Yeah, and that's why I was going to bring that up. When I, actually, as a tail piece, because they don't like doing this, sometimes faculty have chosen to make it part of the assignment so that they hand it in with the assignment. It is worth a small amount of marks, but at the same time, it's communicated why they're doing it. Because students will do it, obviously, when there's marks involved. Margaret?
So you just said that they don't like doing it. Why
Yeah.
do you think they don't like doing it?
It's like what I was going to talk about next about they don't like to reflect. They don't like to do anything extra unless they really see how it's impacting them. They don't want to put anything before, anything extra in the assignment. Yes,
But people generally don't like planning for the future.
that's true.
You know, how many people in this room have a detailed financial plan through to retirement?
Yeah.
That seems much more important than a 10% assignment.
Sure.
People like playing their holiday.
Yeah, sorry. But that's like humans have a natural aversion to planning for stuff.
Good point.
And it's a skill to develop over time.
Now, just to pick up too on reflection, because a big part of learning is reflection. And with the exam reflecting on what they have done. But I find we need to teach reflection. Students are really good about saying, I did this, I did that, but they're really bad about the so what aspect. So if you did this and this, where's the connection? Where's the analysis? How is that going to change you in any way? So reflection is a key piece of metacognition and an important strategy with learning. Some of you may have heard of John Dewey. John Dewey, anyone? Yes. This was an important, powerful quote for myself. We do not learn from experience. And I thought to myself, of course we learn from experience. We have experiential learning. It is key. But the second part of that quote says, we don't learn from experience, we learn from reflecting on experience. And that's the powerful piece. It's that reflection piece. And helping students learn how to reflect is a key piece. Yes. Linda.
I actually sort of took back then to your sports analogy, which
Yes.
I really, really like, that a coach doesn't go out, they play a game, and then that's it.
Right.
they always have the coach and all the trainers, etc., go
Yes.
talk to individual team members, and obviously
Yeah.
at different levels of sport they go
Yes.
far more into psychology and all.
Yes.
But it's that same thing. They don't go out and play a game and then go and have a beer.
Right. They
Some
need
do
to
in
reflect
cricket,
on
but
it.
yes, so they do actually go back and pull the game
analyze.
apart at
Yes.
different levels and analyse and see, well, that happened there. Even these days they video and will actually
Yes.
video and go over their game, whether it's an individual sport, whether it's somebody playing golf, or whether it's a team sport. And that, I think, would get through to some people as to why this is actually that same process. And
I
it's
like
just
that.
a different thought, because, yeah, that makes sense to me.
Thank you for sharing that. That is a powerful thing. Students are a lot of them so athletic, focused, that they need that analogy and see, yeah, that's right. The coach after the game, we analyze it, we see what happened, what went wrong, what went right, that kind of thing, which is really key. Now, we just run low on time, but what I'd like you to do for a minute is talk about what kinds of things are you doing around reflection, around having a plan, monitor. What kinds of things might you be doing already? Or if you're not doing much, you can talk about some of the things that we talked about. And I need to bring you back. I always hate bringing people back because where's the valuable learning going on? At your table, of course. Now, a couple things. Number one, if you'd like digital copies of these so that you can just modify however you want, just send me an email. I'd be happy to just send you digital copies. Feel free. And I have others as well, and you can just modify them and change them how you want because every discipline is going to be a little bit different, but it'll give you a template, some things to try. Any comments, insights that you discussed at your table that you would like to share with the larger group?
Can I say one thing?
Okay.
We actually do a series of, we call them head learning assessment tasks.
Yeah.
And one of the things they ask at the end is it useful? And 85% of students say yes, they like them, yes, it's useful to them.
Yeah.
And the other 15% of students say, yeah, it was 3 marks. So I actually disagree with the statement that someone made about students not liking to look back. They actually, once they realise what it's for and how it's going to, they'll say, yeah, I did like it.
That's
I
good.
just don't tell them it's reflection because they're science students, they go,
So it's a little bit of that communication, which is really key. It goes a long ways. That's good. Thanks for sharing that, Kate. Now, I'm going to move on to growth mindset, just because I'm running lower on time. So, yeah, see Robert. Yeah, you got class. Yeah, no problem. Thanks. Now, growth mindset. Now, something that I do is I go into the labs because they're in a class of 300, and I don't talk about growth mindset with them in a room of 300. What I do is I go into the lab with about 20, and I talk to them about the idea of neuroplasticity and what we know now about the brain, because it's a lot different. When I was growing up, we believed that all humans had about 100 billion neurons. You're born with that 100 billion neurons, and that's how many you have for life. We didn't know anything about neurogenesis, and that in the hippocampus that we are continually, as mammals, creating new neurons all the time. And I'm very thankful for that. At my age, I am very thankful that I am continually having new neurons. And I know even when I was a kid, and you might not be able to relate to this story. Actually, you won't. Well, I'll tell it to you anyway. When I was young, and it was cold, I was on the prairies in Saskatchewan growing up. My mother used to say, wear your tube, because if you freeze your brain cells, that's it. That's it, because you just lose your brain cells, and so you wear your toque. And the toque, for those who haven't seen in Canada, it's that kind of big wool hat that you wear in Canada when it's cold. Because yes, growing up from October through middle of April, it was snow, And it was regularly, for a month at a time, it never got warmer than minus 30 degrees Celsius. So it was very cold, very intense. But I always remember that story. Wear that tube, because you only have so many brain cells, and you don't want to freeze all your brain cells. I should have had to come back, hey, neurogenesis. But I didn't have it back then. So we know a lot more. And I talked to them about times when they're pushing themselves. And I use the example often going to the gym. If I go to the gym and I go to the bench press and I put 10 pounds on that bench press and I do 3 sets of 8, what am I doing for myself? About this? Nothing. Whereas if I put 150 to 200 pounds on that bench press and do 3 sets of 8, what happens? I'm pushing myself, I'm challenging myself, I'm pushing so my muscles will grow. And that's the same with learning. And often I get them to reflect on the last couple months and think, when have they pushed themselves in the class or in the course to learn something new that was challenging? And what do you think happened when you learn that? And they start to realize that yes, by challenging themselves, by pushing themselves, they actually grow. And I also show them this video. How long is this video? 3 minutes. But it's a great video because I say to them, when you know who the narrator is, raise your hand. Well, it's only about 3 seconds and everyone's hand goes up. Why? Because it's the Khan Academy. And up in Canada, everyone uses the Khan Academy to learn. South Hand, do they use Khan Academy down here? Yeah, so this is a really good video. And then we have discussions and we talk about growth mindset. And we do talk about sports and those analogies to help them realize that in part of their life they have a growth mindset. And sometimes in intelligence we get into stuck kind of fixed mindset. So this is one of the strategies, and I'll go into other strategies as well when we talk about grit because it ties right into grit. But does anyone have any other thoughts or strategies that they use for growth mindset? The not yet is a good actual strategy of building a culture around, yes, you haven't been able to do it yet. Jackie?
I really like the example of showing something that they, like a legal analysis that they wrote when they were maybe a first year or a second year.
Yeah.
And then a legal
Growth.
analysis that they wrote when they were a final year. And it's like, see, this looks like it was written by someone in primary school. And look at you can write now.
Yeah.
Yeah. And they
Show
can
that
see
growth.
like it's their
Yeah.
own. Yeah.
That's great. The other thing they highly recommend, not praising that natural ability, praising effort. Why? Because they can control their effort, but they can't control that natural ability. So not always just say, boy, you're really smart, that kind of thing. But that was really great. You put a lot of effort in that and you did well. And?
Yeah, that's interesting because that used to be trotted out as why girls would give up in math in middle school was because their effort was praised, but not their ability. And the boys would stick with it because they were told, oh, you're really smart. So they think it's easy. Whereas the girls were told, well, you've done well because you made a good effort. And then
Right.
they think, oh, that's too much trouble.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Maybe that idea's changed. But I remember
I think it might have changed a little bit because they're really pushing the effort piece rather than that reinforcing the fixed mindset you're born really smart.
this was
Because
a-
then what happens is when they're really challenged, they don't want to look dumb and they're too scared to kind of fail or look dumb, so they won't push themselves into areas they don't want to go. Yes?
So one thing I use is like if you've got like quizzes and mid-semesters and stuff like that, that you can use subsequent exams to upgrade marks. So that like you get 40% in week 4, and then if you get 80% on the final, then you can upgrade your quiz 1 mark to like 60%.
Yeah.
Based on say saying, well, what's important here is that you use the feedback from that quiz to get better. Right, if you do that, you'll get some additional reward for doing it.
That's good. I gotta go to the next piece here. And I did mention about the growth. I'm gonna talk about failure in a second when we talk about grit. But usually what I do, but due to time I won't, I would have you kind of reflect just like I'd have students reflect and kind of monitor their learning. What insights am I having as I experience this class session? What confusions, in other words, this workshop session? What questions are arising for me during the class session? Am I writing them down somewhere? Do I find this interesting? Why or why not? How could I make this material personally relevant? And sometimes I put that on and have participants kind of monitor their own learning. But unfortunately, I don't have the grit. So let's talk a little bit about grit. So this is a model that kind of put together based on kind of all the things I'm doing around metacognition, growth mindset, and grit. So people ask me, how do we support students with grit? Well, here's kind of my formula that I put together, and I'll kind of go through it with you and give you some examples. So first, if you want them to be gritty, provide challenging goals. And you ask yourself, challenging goals, what does that mean? That doesn't mean impossible goals. It means you need to know where your students are at. If you set your bar right here, how high do they go? Right here. If you set the bar here, that's how high they go. If it's unrealistic, you're setting them up for failure. But you want them to be challenged. And another important piece, if you're going to provide challenging goals, you need to communicate those high expectations. How many remember Chickering and Gamson's 7 principles of blah, 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 higher education? A few of you, I see heads nodding. Number 2, recognize it? That's one of the 7 principles, is to communicate high expectations. So if you're going to provide those challenging goals, you need to communicate to them at what level do they need to learn and to push themselves. And what Robin had mentioned a few minutes ago, it's really important for them to be setting some of these goals and to have that buy-in and have them setting that goal to align with that challenge. But they need to set those goals. Another piece is that growth mindset, so that they don't give up, that they don't believe that, oh, I was born this way, there's nothing I can do, so I'm just going to give up. Obviously, they want to have that growth mindset, that they realize they can control the amount of effort they put in, and they will get better with the more effort that they put in. So growth mindset. Now, I put a little bit of a perspective on failure. I'll go through some examples in a minute. But failure is very important. There's 2 views of failure. One, failure is devastating. Should be avoided at all costs. It's horrific. View 2, failure is part of life. We all fail. The key is, pick yourself up, keep going, and learn from that failure. And to embrace challenge, because only through challenge do you really stretch yourself and grow. It's like that gym analogy. If I go in and bench press 10 pounds every day, I'm not doing much. It's that challenge, and to embrace that challenge. And yes, sometimes you will fail, but learn from it. And I'll give you some examples how to teach that as well. Now, to help them achieve those goals, which is grit, give them some strategies like metacognition. Help them with planning, monitoring. Help them anticipate those obstacles and develop plans to overcome them. That's that monitoring piece. So all of this is strategy to help them reach their goals. And the last thing is, shouldn't be last, but it's one of the most important things. If we're going to have high expectations, we need to support the students. That doesn't mean that you give them your private cell number and you say 24/7, give me a call. It means that you have some kind of support in place for the students and communicate that so they know where they can get the help. And that could be peer, it could be a teacher, it could be the library, it could be a lot of different resources. But if you're going to have high expectations, help them get there by having some type of support in place. So let me show you some examples. Now, this is an example of communicating high expectations. This is not my example. This is not my research. This is someone else's research, but this is what they did. So they handed in papers. They randomly put 2 different types of comments on the papers. The first was the placebo. I am giving you these comments so you have feedback on your paper. Nothing wrong with that. Pretty bland. But the other one option, I'm giving you these comments because I have very high expectations and I know you can reach them. Can you see the difference there? There's a little bit of difference. And the key is that 80% of the students who receive this feedback made more edits, because what do students do? They look at their paper, oh, I got 68, and just drop it and do nothing with it. So that communication, that you have those high expectations and that belief in them, helps them with that grit. I'm not going to talk about extracurricular, sorry. But I will talk about failure, because I just picked up on it just a few minutes ago. So it's important to share with students almost a normalcy in that people do fail. And you shouldn't fear failure, because really, you won't get that very, very far. And what I do is talk about some of the famous failure stories. And hopefully they've heard of Walt Disney and Thomas Edison. But if they haven't, chances are for sure they've heard of people like Steve Jobs. Steve Jobs is a very famous person who did fail. He started Apple Computers, one of the biggest companies now in the world. But he got the boot from his own company, which would have been hard. But it's interesting because he reflected and said, I didn't see it then, but it turned out that getting fired from Apple was the best thing that could have ever happened to me. Having failed, but came out the other side stronger. And that's what people do. People fail and try many times, but eventually success. And often we don't see some of those failures. Some of you who grant write, especially in the sciences, how many rejections do you get? Well, if you're getting 100% of your grants, I want to talk to you. It's all about putting in ideas, proposals. Yes, some will get rejected, but some won't. We always hear about those successful ones, though. But often we go through a lot of failure to get there. Now, just to reiterate a couple things. So students need strategy for the grit. And that's where the metacognition, the planning, monitoring, those kind of things that help. So that's kind of the tool. And that's going to be help. And the other piece that supports that perseverance is that growth mindset. We really need to help them understand where they have growth mindsets, and to have that growth mindset in with their intelligence. And often I hear things like in math class, it's really bad for fixed. Art, people say, I can't draw, I can't sing. I still have a fixed mindset about my voice. I cannot sing. But people would say, well, Peter, if you practice, yeah, you might not hit a record, but you get a little better so that people wouldn't cringe every time you stand. But the key is that growth mindset. Jackie,
I was going to say, what happens when you have to modify your goals?
say it again.
What happens when you have to modify your goals? So, so you're working away and being as persistent and persevering as much as you can, and you just come to the realization that it's an unrealistic goal.
Right. And so you need to recognize that too. That, hey, back then I had that goal, and I set little goals to get that goal, but yeah, it's not realistic, or maybe it's not where I want to go now because these other life things happen. Maybe now I'm getting married or something else. And you have to realize, and that's part of learning about goals, is there's some that you will have to modify or ditch because that doesn't align with who you are or where you want to go. Thank you. That's good. Good. Now, I'm going to go to your reflection. We have 3.5 minutes before we wrap this up. 3.5 minutes at the table. I want you to reflect on what you did today. What kinds of things might you use, not use, questions that you have. Do some sharing at your table about what happened in the last 80 minutes. Go ahead. 3 minutes.
I'll probably start with
I've got an assignment next week, some of the tutoring that I'm currently doing or involved in, and it was actually a science crack, but they're third-year students who because they're not given, well, they're not even given to get to there, so they're going to grow and learn to a certain extent. But to give them that mini preparation for assignment prep, but only the mini one as a privilege one of their assignment that they have to write up. So we undertake, by third year, they're actually undertaking a 3-week project that they do in groups, and then collate all the information, and they then have to write a mini research paper. And to actually do and to undertake that, I'm thinking of my assignment actually being going to introduce that to make it a more tangible object rather than just the lecturer explaining this is what you're expected to do. There's quite often that disconnect between them truly qualified students and their parents, between actually understanding the assignment, especially when you do have this 30 assignment due, and I've got mid-semester break to do it, and they've got so many.
20 seconds.
Yeah, and they'll probably do because that's or even if you use before, yeah, even beforehand going, we've got about 3 years, we'll be able to do by first year uni, wouldn't it be great?
Okay, can I interrupt you?
Introduce.
Sorry to interrupt you. We got to wrap this up. There's 2 handouts back here if you want to take on your way out, that's fine. First one is helping them understand what they should be doing during class time, some of the scaffolding during class. At the end, it talks about, well, what were the 3 most important things that you learned? They write them down. Then what happens is that after they wrote them down, the prof writes down the 3, what they thought were the 3 most important things that they learned. Are they the same? Are they different? Get some reflecting and monitoring their learning. This one is about monitoring their learning using kind of metacognitive note-taking. So yes, some room for traditional notes, but how they should be monitoring, making connections to what they already know, helping them with the learning if you want on your way out. Now, if you want digital copies, email me. and I'll get them right to you. I have just a folder of the files, happy to share. They're Word docs, so you can make the changes and use them how you wish. It is 11:59. Any last insights before we go? Thank you very much for participating today. Feel free to connect with me anytime. I'd be happy to talk with you further. Thanks, everyone.